Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 240 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you're watching or reading something set in the medieval world, eventually someone is going to toss down a bag full of gold coins. Because they're so familiar, coins can sometimes seem to be inevitable, a part of the natural order. But in the early Middle Ages, just about everything to do with coins was in flux, from where they were sourced to who was using them. And when viewed through the lens of real history, that cliched bag of coins becomes a whole lot more interesting. This week, I spoke with Dr. Rory Naismith about medieval coins. Rory is Professor of Early Medieval History at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Corpus Christi College. He's the author of several books, including Early Medieval Britain, circa 500 to 1000, Citadel of the Saxons, The Rise of Early London, and Money and Power in Anglo-Saxon England, The Southern English Kingdoms, 757 to 865. His new book is Making Money in the Early Middle Ages. Our conversation on medieval coins, who was using them and who was making them, is coming up right after this. Well, thank you for joining me, Rory. It is so nice to meet you and to be talking about medieval coins. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you very much for having me.
It is my pleasure. Okay, so when we start talking about the Middle Ages, we kind of have to start with the Roman Empire, I think, especially when we're talking about something like coins. So can you set up for us what are coins looking like in the monetary system around coins at the end of the Roman Empire, or what we're calling the end of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, for my purposes at least, that means about the 4th and 5th centuries. So at this stage, the Roman Empire is still a huge state. It's all the Mediterranean, it's Britain, and it's got a very efficient tax system, and the coinage is very closely keyed into that tax system. So they have three major elements to the monetary system. Gold is at the top of the food chain, and it was put there around about the year 300 when there were a series of moves to try and focus more on gold as a kind of stable peg for running the financial machinery of the empire. And this meant the gold solidus. It was very valuable. It's a coin that weighs about 4.5 grams. It's sometimes called the dollar of the Middle Ages. It's the benchmark that everything else is measured against. Now that works fine if you're a wealthy person who can use these fairly valuable coins, and there are a relatively large number of them, but still far less than there are of other things. And of course, if you're not someone who's using gold, you're facing severe inflation and lots of other problems because everything else is valued in terms of this gold. So that's the currency that the state thinks in and that they like to use for paying people in the army, for paying bureaucrats, for high status public things. The money that people actually use on a day-to-day basis is made of copper alloy. It's bronze, it's brass. There's a lot of different denominations. There are vast numbers of coins surviving, millions that survive. If you go and dig up a Roman site down the road from where I am in Cambridge in the UK, you will find some Roman coins of this period. They're incredibly plentiful, whereas the gold, for all that, like I said, there is a relative increase of it, it's still a much, much smaller quantitative element of what's out there. So those are the two major arms. You also have some silver coins, which are usually used as a kind of supplement to gold, and they're particularly used for things like paying off the army, for giving them special one-off payments. And so you tend to find those most plentifully in places like Britain, which was a frontier province with a big military presence. So those are the major elements of the currency that you see in the Roman Empire. They're all pretty large, and they all help sustain an economy that had both a fiscal element to it, of people paying taxes and then the state paying mostly soldiers in return. But there is also a lot of commerce. There's a lot of trade. There's a lot of everything really going on with those coins.
Right. So if you have this many denominations, you have this many kinds of coins, you're seeing people, ordinary people, just using it. Say you want to buy a pint at the pub, you're just using a coin for this?
You probably could do that, yes. You would use a small bronze coin for that, and you would get 1 pint of beer, 1 loaf of bread, 1 knife, or something like that. They're relatively versatile. It means you can do everything from that right up to using 1 gold coin to buy. I mean, there's one anecdote which talks about the amount of gold which is being used to cover the food supply of Rome in a year, and it indicates that 1 gold coin would get you the equivalent of enough pork to eat for a year.
That That's
So
very
it's
specific.
precisely, yes, it's big money. It's the equivalent of hundreds of modern pounds or dollars in one coin, basically. It's
Wow.
it's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine having that in your pocket, right?
Yeah, it's quite frightening, really. But of course, this is a world where you don't have credit cards, you don't have electronic payments. I wouldn't quite say everything is down to coin because there are plenty of other ways in which people stored and moved their wealth. But currency was important and it did cater to large value as well as low value.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you have the Roman Empire, it is a state that works very well from the top down. You have all these levels and everything is legalized and, made sure that it's done in ways that are very, very precise. And then
Mm.
the Roman Empire recedes from much of Europe. So what happens? What does it start to look like in the centuries that follow the recession of the Roman Empire?
There's a long running interest that scholars have had in, well, all sorts of things that happen at the end of the Roman Empire in terms of how it breaks down into a number of separate kingdoms, but also in how the economy changes. And broadly speaking, it looks like there is a degree of continuity, especially in the Mediterranean, and especially in the 5th and 6th centuries. But as you move into the 7th century and after, and especially in areas like Britain and northern Francia, northern Gaul, you can see that all sorts of economic structures and towns and things like that are starting to break down. And the coinage fits into that story. You see in the Mediterranean, they carry on making coins in much the same way, gold ones, bronze ones, silver ones, through into the latter part of the 6th century in both the East Roman Empire, which is still going strong in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in places like Carthage, which is in the Vandal Kingdom of North Africa, or in Rome and Ravenna, which are the major cities of Italy, which in the 6th century, the 5th and earlier 6th century, is ruled by the Ostrogoths. So they keep things running there. But the narrative that you see coming online as you meet the 7th century is one that focuses on contraction of the monetary system. You see far fewer coins being made and used, and the ones which are there are of a narrower range of denominations. It's coming apart at the seams, basically.
And one of the things that you mentioned in the book is sort of the first thing to go, or the thing that's very noticeable, is these smaller denominations in the less important metals. So, can you tell us what happens? What happens to these small metals?
They basically stop making them, or at least they stop making them on any scale. Yes, you're quite right. This is one of the first things to go. They carry on making gold in many areas right through the early Middle Ages because, of course, gold is what you use for the prestige stuff. It's what you use to keep the army going. It's what you use to keep the state machinery running. So that tends to persevere. But yes, the base metal stuff was really made by the Roman state out of probably not even primarily these fiscal concerns. It was mainly down to a tradition of what's sometimes called euergetism, which is sort of state-sponsored sort of charity by private individuals or states towards the public. So this would be bread and circuses is the classic example of this, but it also meant low-value coinage. There was a sense that this was a facility that the state provided for people to use to get by on a day-to-day basis, and post-Roman states simply don't do that anymore. They don't make low value coins anymore. And it raises really interesting questions about what these coins did and how people got by without them. And I think more and more there's a realization among those who work on this period that actually, for all that we are used to a world in which money and coin are seen as the standard, the benchmark, in many ways they were always the kind of imposition. They were not necessarily the natural way of doing things, that there's a wider, richer, deeper tradition of relying on networks of obligation, informal credit. If we live in the same village, it's that you remember that I gave you some hay or helped round up your sheep or whatever it might be, and then you will do the same for me. And we might choose for some purposes to reckon that in monetary terms, but we won't actually exchange cash. And so mechanisms like that are really much more widespread. And so using coins is a way of handling different kinds of transactions with people outside your immediate community. And so not having base metal coins made that a bit harder because you couldn't do it at low values. You had to use more valuable things, or you had to use other mechanisms for doing those exchanges. But it was still possible to do it. So the coins make things easier, but they don't make things it's possible to proceed without them, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're looking at this on a very micro level, you show up at the
Mm.
pub after the Roman
Yeah.
Empire stops making these coins made of copper and bronze and
Mm.
stuff. How are you going to get your
Mm.
pint?
Well, let's hope for a minute that it's your local, you're a regular. The barman will know you. They will trust you. They will say, okay, Daniel, you can have your beer and you can have another beer, as and when you come in, but they'll keep a more or less precise mental tab of what you're doing. And then eventually either you will settle up potentially with a rare gold coin once you've had several £100 worth of pints, or it might be that you will settle up in some other way, that you will perhaps give a sack of, I don't know, a sack of wheat or something to this barman when harvest time comes around, so they can go away and make more beer, or use it to make flour and feed their family or something like that. That was probably quite normal. And you can see this even in later periods, like in the later Middle Ages, early modern period. People had to buy bread very often, and the way this was handled was they would make each loaf of bread from a penny's worth of flour, but depending on the current price. So it's not the other way around. You don't constantly have to worry about chopping and changing your coins. Instead, you make a lot of the commodities to fit the denominations you've got.
Hmm. Well, I think it's important to get down to that level because when you think about it, you have people, not that they never traveled or anything like that, but you're living in a village where you know pretty much everybody. And this has such an impact on everything. So when we talk about other things like executions, for example, it's very hard to execute someone who you've had at the local pub all the time. So this tight relationship, I think, is really important to illustrate by just small examples, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, you can see examples of this all over early medieval Europe. There are documents from 10th century England which talk about how when a bishop bought a piece of land, he paid for it partly in coin, partly with gold, but also partly with horses and sheep. And in Spain, in 10th century Spain, where there are thousands upon thousands of charters, documents recording people giving or selling or exchanging land, very often they talk about money, they talk about exchanging things in very commercialized terms, but they're almost never using coin. They use things like cattle and sheep and cloth and bits of iron and salt and all kinds of things like that. So they are thinking in terms of money. They will often rate all of this in so many solidi or tremices, which were the denominations they'd inherited from Roman tradition, even though in actual fact those hadn't been real coins circulating for centuries, and they probably hardly ever did deal with real coins.
Yeah, it just seems like an easy shorthand to say this is worth this many coins, even though those coins may never show up.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's worth stressing that, of course, now we live in a world where, I don't know about you, but I use coins pretty rarely nowadays. We use other mechanisms that are predicated on those same units and values. And in many other societies in the past, it's been the same, that people will think in terms of notional pounds or dollars or whatever, but what actually changes hands might be very different.
Absolutely. And so, one of the things that we're getting at here, and one of the things that you mentioned a couple of times in the book because it's important, is that if you're going to use a coin with someone, you both have to understand the value of it. And the person who accepts it has to understand that they're going to get the same value for that if they use it somewhere else. And so, people are using coins with outsiders, but cautiously. So, why would you use a coin with an outsider?
That's absolutely right. Yes, you will be using coins with people you outsider is a good term because it's not necessarily going to be someone who's just sort of stepped off a flying saucer from Mars. It's going to be somebody who is probably part of the same, let's say the same society. They'll be from the same kingdom, they'll be from the same general region. They'll know that we can trust coins of King so and so. And that means that if you hand over a silver penny of Charlemagne or whoever, you both, as it were, put your trust in the person who issued the coin. You don't necessarily have to trust each other in the same way. You just need to trust that this is a reliable means of exchange that will be honored by other people and which is backed up by the authority of that ruler. So yes, you're quite right that these coins are particularly versatile when you want to deal with someone you don't have that same level of connection with. And you see that coins are also, for that same reason, particularly popular with those who have to, say, travel over long distances, because they will be going outside those areas where they have close well-developed networks. If there's someone who travels regularly, they will probably actually have a contact in every place along the way, or at least some of them. So they can, to some extent, still do that. But you still see good evidence that travelers are a particularly large constituency of coin users. There's even a wonderful Carolingian capitulae, a sort of series of royal decrees, which talks about how local people involved in local companies make sure that the villagers are not fleecing travelers. They're not overcharging travelers for things like food and accommodation as they move through, because clearly that's been a problem. And of course, as a traveler, you wouldn't necessarily know you were being fleeced. And if you did, you wouldn't have much recourse.
This is one of the reasons why it's good to be in a family of merchants so that you have like this long-standing understanding of how exchange rates work and who's going to be trustworthy, right? So let's talk about exchange rates for a minute, because people are showing up, they're traveling, and they have their own coins. What do they do when they show up with coins from their region and they want to use them somewhere else? There is a structure in place for this, right?
There is indeed, yes. Broadly speaking, you'd have to take them to a money changer or a moneyer. That's a person who both makes coins, but also usually will handle everything else to do with money, so exchanging and things like that. And you will hand over so many English coins and you will get so many Frankish coins in return. Now, we don't actually know very much about how this was handled in practice. We know it must have taken place because it starts to get very rare to find foreign coins in these individual kingdoms. But you can tell by analysing the silver that's in them that they are often made from bullion. They're made from gold and silver that's being brought from France or Germany or somewhere else. So clearly people brought these in. Probably they would be getting what to us would seem like a very bad exchange rate. We don't, again, there's not much direct evidence for this, but we do know that in the later Middle Ages, there were hefty premiums attached to exchanging money on that kind of scale, sort of up to 10 or 20% of value. It cost a lot. Yeah, and of course, to make this even worse, some kingdoms, some states in the Middle Ages also operated their own kind of internal monetary reforms, where you would decree that right now we're going to stop using this old kind of coin and we're going to start using this new kind of coin, and everyone needs to exchange, everyone who wants to do business with the state needs to exchange their old ones for the new ones. And there would be a cost that came with that.
Yeah. They get you coming and going. But I mean, there's only two inevitable things, right? Death and taxes. And so when it comes to tolls on things, I think everyone is expecting they're going to get fleeced at some point. And one of the nice examples you had in the book was of having a merchant coming with goods, exchanging them for coins in the marketplace in the place that he's arrived, using those coins in that same marketplace for goods and taking them back to avoid all of this money changing.
That's right. Yes, I think that's right. I think that merchants who could possibly do so would avoid taking large amounts of coin back and forth because they would constantly suffer from this. Instead, what you would do is you'd go from point A with the goods you want to sell and you'd sell them. You do so using the local money when you had to, but then you'd also buy the goods you want to take back again, and then off you'd go. And so you'd actually carry a relatively small amount of cash between these two places. The one exception to this is if, of course, the coins or silver or gold themselves are one of the commodities you want to pass on. And this might well have been the case. In fact, it has to have been the case because there are plenty of places where there were no gold or silver mines, and yet they have a fairly substantial gold and silver currency. So it must have been coming from somewhere, and one assumes that there's enough demand that merchants are bringing it over from wherever that gold and silver is plentiful.
Mm-hmm. One of the examples that you mentioned is that you have, I think it was if I'm thinking of the right example, that amazing melted bit of metal that shows that Vikings are taking silver in exchange probably for slaves, bringing it up, melting it down, and using it for something else. So can you tell us a little bit about that example?
I can, yes. There is a vast amount of Islamic silver made in places like Baghdad and Samarkand and mint place in what's now the Middle and Near East. This was taken up by merchants through what's now Ukraine and Russia into the Baltic, Scandinavia, and sometimes further afield to Iceland, Ireland, Britain, places like that. It was an enormous flow. There are literally hundreds of thousands of these which have been found in modern times. There was even one hoard found in Sweden on the island of Gotland, which contained, I think it was almost 70 kilos of silver, a huge amount, about the weight of a grown person in silver. Some of that, a lot of it was coin, and the rest of it was arm rings and things which were made from melted down coin. So it's just colossal amounts. And yes, you're absolutely right that this is probably related to the movement of high value commodities, including slaves. The other thing that's very distinct about this side of the monetary economy is that although it's very much silver and it's being used in much the same way as coins are used elsewhere, they think about them very much as metal, not as coins. They aren't that bothered whether they are small and round or even of a consistent weight. They're much more worried about how good the silver is. So what you see is that quite often these things are being cut up, melted, tested by being poked with a knife. There's a whole etiquette, a whole system of handling these things, which involves weights and scales and testing processes. It's a very different kind of economy. In some ways, it was a lot more cumbersome and challenging because in individual exchanges, you'd need to go through all these checks to make sure you weren't someone wasn't trying to pull a fast one over you. So there's a lot of potential for tension there. But at the same time, it's very versatile because you're not going through the state. You're not going through minting these coins. So actually, it's very fluid in terms of large scale movement. It's just a little bit problematic in terms of the grassroots, face-to-face exchanges between individuals.
It's interesting to think about money in terms of it's just being a resource, because I think we so often think of it in terms of these numbers that we just see on a screen or something like that. But when we think about it as being something that could be melted down, so much more makes sense. For example, when you have people in the Middle Ages who are filling their house with objects that they can later melt down if they need coins. So they're having objects made of gold and silver instead of coins, which is something that might seem weird to us. But when you have an unstable coin system, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, there's always a lot of back and forth between coined money when it consists of gold and silver and precious metal in other forms that people would think of. There are many examples of this. There are lots of inventories of the relics and books in churches where they think about it very much in terms of pounds of gold and silver with a financial monetary implication, that this is so much direct value in gold and silver. They're not that bothered if this is a picture of Saint so-and-so or whatever it might be. For these purposes, it's just X amount of gold and silver. So yes, that's absolutely right. And if the chips were down, people sometimes did melt their resources and turn them into cash. There's a wonderful passage in a text from Ely, which is a cathedral just down the road from where I am in Cambridge, in the 11th century, where they talk about how things got so bad when King William the Conqueror was putting the squeeze on them that they had to melt down some of their treasured relics. People did do this sometimes.
Yeah, and it makes complete sense when you think about that. Again, that instability and not knowing if the coin with the stamp of this person on it is going to be worth anything without being melted down. So we're talking we're talking about melting down coins that already exist. But let's go right back to the beginning. Where are people getting the metals from? Because, it's a coin that exists. It's already an object. People think of it as an object that is stable, but it actually has to come from somewhere. So where are people getting the metal from?
That's a really good question because, yes, that's absolutely right. The value of the gold and silver that goes into individual coins is not always exactly the same as the value they would be accepted at, because, of course, otherwise there wouldn't be much reason to keep them as coins. You just melt them down. So the Vikings are unusual in that respect. In Scandinavia, the Baltic, Russia, Ukraine, places like that, they do think of silver and when they've got it, gold in those terms. But elsewhere, coins are coins, and they will contain gold and silver as a kind of guarantee, but there is a little bit of a difference between the value of the metal and the value of the coin. You still need your gold and silver, though, and there were a number of ways these could be obtained. If you were in that eastern northern zone, it was likely to be initially these dirhams, these Islamic coins coming from the east. They later on switched to using coins from Western Europe, coins from Germany and England in particular. Within Germany and England and the rest of Western Europe, they use a number of resources. And in fact, there's still a lot of research to be done on how these different sources are tapped and when new ones come online. Because I suppose there's a few different things you could do. There's using freshly mined gold and silver, which happened on a large scale when there were mines available, but that was not always the case, or they might be a long way away. You might melt down foreign coins, which are coming in. We talked about that a moment ago. You might also melt down your own coins in these processes of monetary reform. The last thing you could do is you could melt down stuff you had already, like we were just talking about in Ely. And I've done some interesting work recently, after the book came out, in fact. I did this on where the silver in a group of coins made in England in the late 7th, early 8th centuries came from, because this is a period of rapid expansion in the scale of the monetary economy, lots more coins being made and used, lots of uncertainty until recently on where that silver came from. No one was entirely sure. And after a round of work looking at the trace elements in these, that is to say, the very small amounts of gold, bismuth, lead, other things, which are a reflection of the original ore that the silver came from, plus the lead isotopes, which again are a reflection of the original ore it came from, we were able to show that this silver came overwhelmingly from the Byzantine Empire. So it had been brought up to northwest Europe, probably in the 6th and early 7th centuries, and is then stockpiled there on a very large scale, and then liquidated, melted down in the late 7th and 8th centuries. So they've built up this massive amount of silver, probably tons of this silver, and then they gradually whittle it down again, turning it into thousands upon thousands of these little tiny coins.
That's fascinating, because when you think about the individual people who are bringing wagons, wagons full of this stuff across a continent, it's just, yeah, it's an incredible story.
Yeah, it is. It's been absolutely fascinating, and it really adds a level of depth to these coins, to what we understand from them. That they are obviously coins, you use them for buying and selling, but they are used by people to do real things, and the silver has to come from somewhere. It has to be made. It has to pass into circulation. And this is one of the things I wanted to try and explore a bit in the book, because I think that there is often a distinction between the motives that lead to making coins and then how they are used subsequently. Because of course, you only need to make a coin once, and you only have to put it into circulation once. But after that, it can be used again and again and again. And very often it would probably be used again and again and again by quite different people for quite different purposes. So it's, I think, really crucial to identify what we think the initial reasons are for making these coins, because it's got to happen on a relatively large scale. People aren't going to set up minting facilities for one peasant turning up with 5 pennies and a turnip. It's got to be someone who's got rather more resources. And so I think that very often the minting process is driven primarily by wealthy people inside. It's aristocrats, it's churches, it's kings, it's people like that. But actually the use of these coins is much more diverse. And so there's often a bit of a tension between those two things, that the making of coin is comparatively controlled and restricted socially and often geographically as well. But the use of it in transactions between average people is often much wider and much more varied in character.
Yeah, it's always so fascinating when you find a coin that was made in one place and then you find it in the most random place later. I think that's so fascinating. What happened to this coin in between? But this also begs the question, and someplace I wanted to go, so thanks for bringing us there. In the Roman state, everything is very centralized. You have the state making the coins. And as you're saying, as this kind of collapses in some ways, some areas, who is making the coins? Like, who has the right to make the coins and who is actually making the coins?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. In the Roman world, they have a very small number of very large scale, like industrial scale mint places. And there are only about 20 of these recorded for the late Roman Empire. There are far more if you go back a bit earlier, because they've got traditions of making local coins. But by the time you're in the era of Constantine the Great, Valentinian, Theodosius, there are often only 5 or 6 places making coins for the whole empire. And they're organized based on provincial government and administration. They're organized based on taxes. For gold, which is such a prestigious element of this coin, there's often only one place making those coins, wherever the emperor himself would happen to be. So that's the way the Romans do things. It's very centralized, it's very controlled. In the early medieval world, it's often a lot more dispersed. It's often tied up with the exercise of local power, which would be delegated to a wider range of people by the king. Or it might be tied to not necessarily the distribution of taxes, but the payment of taxes. So if you, let's say, are a landowner and there is a tax charged on your land, it might be part of your right to arrange for the making of coins on that land, which will then be paid to the king, and very likely you will pocket some of the proceeds along the way, so it will work to everyone's benefit. And this means that what you see in the early medieval period is a big expansion of places where coins are being made, and of the agencies, the people who are patronizing those locations. In the Merovingian Frankish kingdom, so broadly speaking, France, Belgium, parts of the Netherlands, Western Germany, Switzerland, there are about 600 to 800 recorded mint places and thousands of moneyers who would make the coins there. By and large, they don't tell you this was made for this particular patron. They just say the place and the name of the moneyer, which in this case means a kind of craftsman / official who would take charge of that process and put their name on the coin, not simply out of advertising for how wonderful and skilled a moneyer they are, but out of a kind of, it's almost a kind of liability. You know, so if you've got a problem with this coin, you know where to go, you know who is responsible for it. And in fact, we know that in some other places where they have that system in place, like England in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, occasionally they did go after the moneyers who had made bad coins. There was an occasion in the 1120s when the moneyers were blamed for many, many acts of corruption in the kingdom, and the punishment that was decreed for them was that they would have one of their hands and their testicles cut off.
Mm-hmm. Serious business.
Very serious business, yes. And we know that this was actually carried out on many of the moneyers. It could happen. There's a 10th century Anglo-Saxon law code which says that if this punishment is carried out of cutting off the hand of a nefarious moneyer, the hand should be stuck on a spike on top of the building where the crime was committed. So there's a very public dimension to this. It's a kind of deterrent as well. And it's a signal that the currency, the coinage, is obviously delegated to these people to make it. But at the same time, it's a reflection of the king's authority, the king's say-so. And if you are doing something dodgy with the coinage, it's a direct insult to the king and all he stands for. So that's why they come down on you and your appendages like a ton of bricks.
Yes, you and your appendages. Yes, absolutely. So if you have a whole bunch of people, thousands of people who are making coins within the same kingdom, are they sent like a template, make them with this picture on them, or are they distinct? Like you've mentioned that they have the stamp of the person who's actually made them, but are they all supposed to look the same?
It depends when and where you are. There are some points when there is a fair amount of difference. So in England, about the year 700, when they've got these many silver coins made out of Byzantine silver, there's a huge amount of diversity. There are hundreds of different coin types in circulation. So it looks like this is really a kind of monetary free-for-all. It's almost a kind of language of an expression of power, an expression of wealth and authority. You have your own coins for your own purpose, and people presumably just had to muddle through. It's a little bit like having thousands of private banks issuing their own dollars in North America in the early 19th century, when, you know, it was very hard to know if a dollar from a place even just a few towns away was good or not. It was a really complicated situation. But there were also some cases in the early Middle Ages when it was much more centralized. So in the kingdom, well, the Empire of Charlemagne in about 800, the kingdom of the English in the 10th, 11th centuries, there was a very, very high premium based on uniformity, uniformity for its own sake. They wanted everyone to be singing from the same hymn sheet because that was a way of creating cohesion. That was a way of making everything work in a way the king wanted them to. And this had all sorts of resonances. It was in part a religious thing, because there was a strong tradition of thinking about coins, good quality coins, as a reflection of a good soul. You know, you could look at a coin and it might seem okay, but it could be completely corrupt and rotten on the inside. And this is a metaphor that's used in the Bible itself. It's used by a whole series of patristic writers. And this was picked up in the early Middle Ages. You know, there was a sort of reversal there, that a good coin didn't just reflect a good soul. A whole kingdom with good coins must be a whole kingdom with a good collective soul, basically. And so that's why they institute these standardizations, these reforms of the currency. It's kind of protection against forgery. It's a demonstrative, performative act of making sure everything is good and pure, because the kings basically aren't able to do all that much. Otherwise, that is a demonstration of that kind of power. So doing it with a coinage was a way of showing everyone that we mean business in trying to pull our spiritual socks up.
It's true. It's true. Having that symbol, and they often have Christian symbols on them. So it really ties money and faith together in ways that maybe we wouldn't recognize or think about on the day to day.
Yeah, that's right. And it makes this really fascinating combination of very, very centralized overall conception, but also highly localized implementation. So, I've done a lot of work on how this played out in England in the 10th and 11th centuries, because there you've got not just this sequence of coin reforms, which means you can date these things fairly well, but you also get the name of both the moneyer and of the place, the location where they made coins. And so you've got, again, thousands of individuals, you've got about 120 places, some of which are teeny tiny and haven't actually ever been identified, some of which are London or York or Winchester, and they issue many, many thousands of surviving coins. And you can see that these moneyers are fascinating characters. Some of them come up in Domesday Book, this big survey of who owns property in the 11th century, in 1066 and then in 1086. And you can see that they are people of kind of middling status and wealth. They are important in their local area. They're not important on a national level, but within an area of a few villages or within a town, they're the kind of trustworthy, solid person that people would turn to as an individual who could make you some money, as in actually turn silver into coin for you. And this was a matter not just of being a merchant or being rich, it was a matter of being well connected and someone that people would put their faith in. So yeah, that's the kind of person who would be a moneyer. There's even one lovely example from London where they don't just have the name of the town, they have the name of the street where this moneyer is based. So they think about this in very, very localized terms.
It's interesting. It is not a job I would want because I think you would get pressure
Yes.
from everywhere. Like, could you just, tweak this a little bit, and it
Yeah,
would be tempting. I think, especially if, only people who are metalsmiths will really know the difference unless they throw it
that's
on a
right.
scale. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are so many of these moneyers at certain points that they can't all have been metalsmiths. They must have been other people doing other things who just get in on the act when there is enough demand or pressure for them to do so, and they often vanish again pretty quickly, not necessarily because they've had various things cut off, but because essentially the demand has faded, that it doesn't make sense for them to do it anymore. And for most of these moneyers, I suspect it wasn't their day job, as it were. It wasn't their main bread and butter. It was one of a number of things they would do alongside maybe being a landowner, maybe being a merchant, maybe being someone who's involved in other aspects of local government, that it's a part of a portfolio, basically.
That's interesting. It's very interesting, especially because so many bits of the Middle Ages in terms of careers are
Mm.
locked in, and that is what you do. And so having a portfolio career is like a
Yeah.
gig economy. It's nice.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We do know there were some sort of professional moneyers who would be known as, so and so the moneyer, even in contexts that are nothing to do with coinage. But because that was so unusual, it makes you wonder if most moneyers aren't necessarily working that way. They are part-time moneyers, basically. Yes, they are gig economy moneyers. That's a good way of putting it.
So I have to ask, so we're talking about mostly gold and silver. We've lost a lot of the base metals in terms of
Yeah.
currency. So when do people start clipping coins and using this as currency? Is this something that's always happened, or is that something that happens later? Because it causes
Mm.
a lot of, appendages to be lost later in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
So when do people start clipping their coins?
That's a very good question. It's not, clipping is apparently not as big a problem in the earlier Middle Ages. You're absolutely right that it becomes a very widespread concern in the 13th, 14th centuries. Earlier on, it looks like there is some forgery going on. People are making dodgy coins from time to time, but it looks like it's not quite as endemic a problem. And in part, that's because the way a lot of these coins are made makes it a bit harder, that these are often made using what was probably a kind of heavy-duty pastry cutter. So the coins are almost perfectly round in the Carolingian world, in the late Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And the very early silver ones are very, very small. They're usually usually about 10 millimeters in diameter, so it's not really very practical to clip them. That only makes sense when you've got a kind of rim that you can trim bits off without people noticing. But yes, we do know that people were sometimes trying to pull a fast one. They were making coins that carried a made-up moneyer's name, or there's even a wonderful series of documents from 11th century Catalonia which talk about married couples who have been caught for forgery and punished for forgery. And that's interesting because, of course, if you move on into the later Middle Age and the early modern period, women are often very heavily implicated in currency crimes. And this was apparently going on in the 11th century already too, that women were involved, particularly in retail trade, and this is where a lot of coin use came up. So it makes sense.
Especially because women are just as devious as men. You'd be looking at these coins saying,
Oh, yeah.
you'll probably trim this a little bit.
Yes, there's a great document that comes from the Frankish kingdom in the 860s, which talks about how the king has heard that at a frustratingly unspecified location somewhere in his kingdom, a group of people, and he goes on to say that in fact mainly women, low status women, have been refusing good quality coin. And this is almost as big a crime as forging coin, because of course it undercuts the legitimacy and authority of the whole system. And so he's dispatching some special delegated judges to deal with this problem, and he gives them instructions. He says that unusually they've got to be accommodating for things like age and economic circumstances and gender, and that for the first offense they should go light. But if somebody is caught offending a second time, they will have the coin that they rejected heated up and used to brand them on the forehead.
Wow. Creative.
And again, very public, yes.
Yes, and definitely memorable. Okay, so moving away from torturous punishments. So near the end of the book, you basically wrap up with the rise of the penny. Why is the penny so important?
Well, the penny is the benchmark currency for medieval Europe for centuries, really. And you can see as you move into the 12th century, which is effectively where I stop, the quantity of pennies in circulation, at least in certain parts of Western Europe, Northern Italy, it increases dramatically, far beyond anything we've seen in the early Middle Ages. So it's the same basic format of coin. It's a silver piece, usually pretty pure, weighing about 1 to 1.5 grams. But instead of finding a few thousand of these, you're starting to find tens of thousands of them. So it's just moving things onto a whole different level. And it sets the scene for a whole series of other economic changes that you see as you go on into the years beyond about 1200. So I was trying to emphasize in the book that this earlier period is in many ways interesting, not because it's always a success story. In many ways, it's not a success story. But what it shows is how adaptable and flexible the monetary economy was at a time when, in a lot of respects, the chips were down, when these things were not available in the quantity you might want or in the range of denominations you might want, and yet people did still use them. So my main question was, okay, why did they do that? How did they do that?
Yes. And for people to learn more than we've been able to cover today, they can look at your book because you get into it in so much depth and detail. And it's a great book. I hope everybody checks it out. So thank you so much for joining me to talk about coins.
Thank you for having me.
To find out more about Rory's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of Cambridge or find him on X at Rory_Naismith. His new book is Making Money in the Early Middle Ages. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, I actually just came back from a lecture at the University of Toronto. It's been a while since I've been there, but a person named Taryn Andrews was speaking, and I thought she did a really good job. So I just want to kind of shout out to her. She was kind of talking about like colonialism and comparing what's happened in the Norman conquest of England with what happened to Native Americans in the United States, specifically like the Doomsday Book and something called the Dawes Act from the 19th century. And it was really kind of an interesting comparison. So that's a person you might want to keep an eye on for the medievalists, named Taryn Andrews.
Nice. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So on the website itself, we have a new news piece about the Gribshunden. In English, it's like the Griffin's Head. And it is a warship that was sunk in 1495. It basically caught fire off the coast of Sweden, sank. Divers discovered it in the 1970s, but didn't tell anybody about it. till the year 2000.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, they've been doing a lot of research, and it's just like every year they find new stuff. And this year they were able to figure out what the ship's size was and how it may have looked. But also they found a war chest in there, and it probably belonged to the German mercenaries that were on board, but it was like ammunition, pieces of metal, but fascinating stuff for you, like the intricacies of medieval warfare.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a piece on that. Plus, we have a piece on how to be a medieval shepherd.
Nice. I was just talking about that with Richard Hoffman last week.
Yeah, exactly. It was the same text as this 14th century shepherd who kind of like, here's what I do and here's my life. It was very funny. He talked about being a child, and his first job was taking care of pigs and horses, and he hated that. But he found doing the sheep much, much better. So he has this kind of guide. There's even parts about what mittens to wear.
Perfect. I mean, if you're going to be spending all that time outside being a shepherd, it's important to know which mittens to wear.
Yeah, he's got that, plus, a bunch of other stuff. He seems to be a nice guy to his sheep, so.
Good to know.
We've got all that and much more on medievalist.net.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indies through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. And there's a whole lot more interesting stuff that's going to be added very soon. To get in on all the action and support your favorite medievalists, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from money to honey, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sobalski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.